Okay, the purpose of this video is to think about how narratives can be persuasive. And this is extremely important whether you're, say, a writer of fiction, to think about how you're constructing your narratives to be persuasive, or in what ways they may be interpreted as persuasive, but also to think about how narratives influence us. And the thing to realize here is that humans love stories, and we've been telling stories for a very long time through the oral tradition. And Hauser, in my reading of Introduction to Rhetorical Theory by Gerard Hauser, it's too short of a section, page 20 to 20 through 21, too short of a section here, so I want to supplement these ideas and this information. There's this whole kind of branch of thinking that I'd like to get at, that looks at archetypal narratives and archetypal characters and how they've re-emerged, how they've emerged and re-emerged throughout time, throughout stories. And so that's what I want to talk about today. So we love stories, right? We watch films, we empathize with the principal characters, usually the protagonist. We have a kind of emotional journey when we watch a movie, let's say, or we read a great work of fiction. We place ourselves in these new worlds. And they're usually perhaps why narrative emerged as a useful, say, technology for humans alongside language, is because of its didactic or educational function, right? Through story you can teach ethics, morals, you can show what a hero is supposed to be, you can show what a good life is supposed to look like, you can demonstrate what good and evil are, you can show what does a villain do and what does a hero do and how do they respond to various situations, and captivate an audience with a dragon and some swords and magic and all these wonderful things. So stories are extremely powerful, and they influence us, and they're very instructive, right? And so for Hauser, he says a narrative is scripted, and what it does is it kind of demonstrates, say, what is normative and how we should act in the world. And we learn a lot from stories. We learn a lot from films. Now, I want to introduce a concept that's not in the Hauser, which is the idea of the hero's journey, which comes from Joseph Campbell, who is a really interesting intellectual figure. You might know his PBS series, The Power of Myth. His most famous work is A Hero with 1,000 Faces. And what Campbell did was look at myths from cultures from across the world and tried to find the unifying elements of them. So certain parts of myths from all over the world have very similar, say, moves in them, very similar themes. So, and in fact, the cultural rituals of people across the world have a lot of similar elements to them. Say, the use of masks and dance, and the young people leaving their home to go out into the wilderness to go through some kind of ritual of adulthood and coming into being, and then returning to home. And these are paralleled in many of the religious stories, many of the myths, and in much of our fiction. And so I thought what I could do here is draw out some similarities. Say, and I don't always like to talk about popular culture, but this is really useful here. So if we look at, say, the story arcs of three very popular pieces of literature and film, we look at Star Wars. The screenplays are by George Lucas. If we look at Harry Potter, the books by J.K. Rowling and the films, and we look at Tolkien's work, J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, and those film adaptations, there's some really fun similarities in these stories that go back to, say, some of these Homeric epic myths, and probably before that too, right? But before Homer, we have the Iliad and the Odyssey that survived through time. Not everything has survived from the ancient world, so we have some pre-Homer right before Homer. We have some poets like Hesiod, his Theogony, which is this kind of construction of the history of the gods, right? Theogony. You have some other pre-Homeric poets, and certainly for at least, I would like to say, it seems to me, this, I don't like to conjecture too much, I try to be scientific, but we found archaeologically, say the Chauvet caves, cave paintings, 30,000 years ago, maybe back further, 50,000 years. We have musical instruments that have been dated to about 30,000 years ago. So it's, I think we can say it's likely that humans were telling stories around their music, and some even skin hide, like deer hide drums, are probably older than that too, but I don't recall off the top of my head now. But so this oral tradition goes back a very, very far away. Now remember, in contrast, written language has only been around for maybe 8 to 10,000 years. It depends where you kind of demarcate it, and of course, you know, the dating's not perfect, but some of the earliest writings we have are, say, like they appear to be business transactions. Say, here's some grain for this or that, maybe even related to the production of alcoholic beverages. It's not exactly clear to me, and that's not my field of study, but there's some interesting things to learn there about what are some of the earliest written, recorded documents in the world that we've uncovered. But okay, let's look at these three. These three stories have something very in common. First off, let's think about the say primary protagonist in Star Wars, Harry Potter, and Lord of the Rings. So Star Wars, we have Luke Skywalker, young man, not necessarily particularly skilled, fairly ordinary at the beginning. In Harry Potter, we have a very ordinary, like, orphan boy. This is what we know at the beginning, right? And there's some irony here because we find out that they're actually extraordinary individuals, but nonetheless, at the beginning of these stories. And then we have Frodo in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, who's a very unassuming individual, stays at home, right, in the Shire. Okay, so very unassuming characters who then go through great trials, right, and are assisted by a cast of friends. And in each of these stories, there's an archetypal character, a wise old man, right? You have Gandalf the wizard, you have Dumbledore the wizard, the elder individual, and then you have Ben Kenobi, the old Jedi master, right, who instructs Luke Skywalker in say the arts of being a Jedi and finding this mysterious force, right? And in Harry Potter, you have the mystery of magic. And in the Lord of the Rings, you have, say, the magic of the ring. So this is another kind of archetypal narrative structure, is you have some kind of, say, you have an ordinary world and a special world. And I'll post this diagram on the Canvas page, and I'll put a link here in the video too, so you can look at it if you're not in the course and watching this video. So what happens to Frodo? He leaves the Shire and enters into the special world, or the rest of the world, right? This kind of extraordinary world where things happen. Luke Skywalker leaves Tatooine, his home planet, and goes out into space where there's this rebellion and the Empire and all sorts of forces working. It's the special world versus the ordinary world of home. And for Harry Potter as well, of course, this is especially a clear demarcation between the ordinary world, the, say, Muggle world, and the magical world of Hogwarts and wizards and spells and creatures. So this is a very common trope in stories. And it goes back to some, I think, it seems to go back to some of these old cultural rituals of leaving the home and going to find adulthood, right? It's kind of a coming of age practice and story that's been part of human culture for a very long time. So this is interesting. They meet an archetypal old man character, right? And then they have a group of say, unlikely allies, right? And a group of unlikely allies. Chewbacca, Samwise, Ron Weasley, right? The kind of unlikely Hermione, the kind of unlikely characters and cast that come along with their own sort of faults and their own sorts of skills that assist the hero in this journey, assist that principal protagonist in the journey. what do they often do? They often descend into what's called the belly of the whale, right? Say the belly, we call this the belly of the whale, the descent into hell or the descent into darkness. So in The Lord of the Rings, the descent into, say, Moria, the mines of Moria. For Frodo and friends, it's quite a literal descent. In the first Harry Potter film and book, the group of friends descend, Harry Potter and Ron and Hermione descend into, past the Cerberus, the three-headed dog, into this road of trials, right, to find the Sorcerer's Stone or the Philosopher's Stone. In the Star Wars series, there's the descent into the trash compacting pit, when they're in the Death Star at this point. The story kind of eludes me right now, but there's usually a descent, right? A kind of descent into hell, and then coming out of that. Now, also similar across these three stories, there's usually some kind of magical item that helps the protagonist along. So the lightsaber is the magic sword, right? You have the ring in The Lord of the Rings, and the mithril, the protective garment that has magic power. In Harry Potter, perhaps the wand or the invisibility cloak, right? You have some kind of magical item that assists the protagonist along in the journey. Now, what about the villains, right? You have some kind of extraordinary villain who maybe has some kind of humanity to them, right? You have Darth Vader, who, I don't want to spoil anything, but right, it turns out to be the father of, it turns out to be Luke's father, right? And so there's this kind of humanizing connection. But then there's a greater evil, right? There's this Darth Sidious, or am I mixing up the plots now? I don't remember, but there's some greater evil beyond. But a humanized villain figure. You have Voldemort in the Harry Potter series, who's not, right? We know that there's a kind of interesting developmental process there, that it's not a pure evil, right? It's not necessarily, right? That there was maybe something that happened along the way. I don't recall the story in enough detail to talk about that at length. You can leave me comments and get mad at me for misremembering the details. And then Sauron is kind of interesting as perhaps more representative of a absolute evil. And I think sometimes Tolkien is a little bit criticized for playing too much like good versus evil, but these are classic stories, is the, good versus evil. And this is symbolized often as the form of, like, say, the dragon, right? The evil is the dragon. And in so many stories, we have the evil creature embodied as the dragon, not always taking that form, right? Not always taking the form of a giant lizard creature, but taking some kind of evil form, really evident in, say, the second Harry Potter film, the basilisk, right? An actual sort of dragon, an actual reptile creature that they fight. But this goes back, of course, we have the biblical snake story, Satan taking the shape of the snake in the Garden of Eden. And perhaps that's related to some kind of evolutionary biological, or not a phobia of snakes because they're venomous, right? There's some interesting links here between, it's not just, right, there may be actually like some evolutionary ties as to why these stories are so persuasive too. Why do we have giant spiders in so many of these, in both The Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter? A giant spider is horrifying, right? It's a trope. It's a trope that's utilized. Okay, so these kinds of analyses we could drag on and on and on, and they're fun to play with and they're fun to think about. But I then challenge you to think about, okay, why do they work? Why do they work on us so well? And what do they instruct us about? What do they try to teach us and instruct us about? And it's interesting, George Lucas, who wrote the Star Wars screenplays, knew Joseph Campbell really well and was, say, a student of his, or in some sense a disciple. And Joseph Campbell was a constant visitor to George Lucas throughout his life until Campbell passed away. So these stories we know are, like, from the author himself, we know are directly influenced by this. But some of these, Tolkien's work seems to be, this kind of early fantasy tradition seems to be influenced from myth and from religious stories. And these connections, I urge you to look for them these what we call sometimes meta-narratives, archetypal narratives, archetypal characters. I urge you to look for where these emerge, and to think about your own kind of, what is your own journey in life, and what, say you go through these sorts of processes too, and in the stories that you write too. Think about, right, this has to do quite a bit, right, with plot development. What are the obstacles that your characters face? Who are their allies? Who are their enemies? What is their ordinary world? Where do they go? Geographically, if it's detailed fiction, you have world building, right? Where in the world do they go, and how do they leave home, and what happens when they return home? Often when the hero returns home, something has changed. In the Homeric works, the hero comes home and everything is different, right? The wife has been, unfaithful or something, or has suitors, and the world is at war, and we see this in the Tolkien works too. Different from the films, the books and films differ in this regard. When the hobbits return back to the Shire, in the books, the Shire has been, say, devastated, which is not what occurs in the films. But anyway, think about some of these, like, why are these persuasive? Why do these work? What do they try to teach us? It's worth really kind of playing over in your mind, and look for these types of archetypal characters and narratives. You'll see them all over. I mean, The Lion King, Game of Thrones has lots of these. The arc of Jon Snow is very much like this. The leaving the ordinary world to the special world, to go to the Wall, from Winterfell to the Wall, and then even beyond the Wall into the world of magic and darkness, and the descent into hell, so to speak, an icy hell. But and the same with, say, the Daenerys plot is, away from Westeros home, and then the return home, and what are the trials, and who are her unlikely allies, and Barristan Selmy as the wise old man, and for Jon Snow it's Aegon Targaryen, Master Aemon, right? So you have all these kinds of repeating archetypal structures and characters and narratives, and so that's enough for now. But something to think about. I wanted to supplement some of these ideas from Hauser, because narratives are extremely powerful, and we've been using them for a very long time. And as writers, it's useful to think about how we construct narratives and to what end. And this maybe conflicts with say, what some authors have been doing for a few decades in postmodern literature, where we're kind of deconstructing these meta-narratives, trying to deconstruct these classic story arcs. But there's something still really powerful about these classic stories that still repeat themselves in successful fiction today. And that's something to note about, say, Game of Thrones, the most watched television show ever, as of now, making this video. I'm speaking in September of 2019, the most watched television show ever. And it has a lot of these classic, right? Star Wars, one of the most successful film franchises ever, and it has a lot of these elements in it. There's something very, very persuasive and powerful about these types of archetypal characters and narratives. And it's not that they're the be-all, end-all, and not all stories have to follow them, but you can play with these elements and think about why they work. Okay, I could go on at length about this probably, but I wanted to bring this up. Something to research and look at is, in how are narratives persuasive, and it's something you can connect to your writing and your story development. And I'll post a link here to some of these graphs that show Campbell's construction of these various elements. And for example, he has 8 stages of the monomyth. He might, what we call the meta-narrative or something like that, right? So thanks for watching. Hope this was interesting for you. Take care of yourselves.